today's session is just an informational session, meaning we're going to be talking about how Google Classroom works, what are the benefits of using it within our Wildwood system, and hopefully giving you some time to work on it with us in this space. And then next, we'll be having a session during Intro Week, which will be a little bit more towards some of these new guidelines that we've put together for the use of Google Classroom. And that one's going to be mandatory. This one's optional, just to get to know the product or get to know the tool and get used to it. The second one's going to be required. If you want to use Google Classroom in the fall term at Wildwood, you'll need to attend that other session, and more information will come out about that once the Intro Week schedule gets out there.
So now that we're about to get started, we're just going to ask that you mute yourself, and there will be an option for Q&A. Speaking of which, Nick, can you give a little info about that?
Yeah. So we think an easy process for this to work is by creating a parking lot. And so we've done that using Jamboard. And so if you have a moment right now, take this link, bit.ly.Q&A Jamboard, and I'll actually type that in the chat while we're talking about it. We want you to go ahead and open that. And Mira, you can go ahead and advance. I'll drop the link in the chat so that everybody doesn't have to type it in.
And then here you can see this is what the parking lot is. So if you have any questions while we're presenting, just drop in a, right here you can see sticky note, drop in a sticky note. So we can just capture that while we're doing our presentation.
And so at the end of the presentation, we'll be looking through those sticky notes and answering any questions you may have thought of in the process. And it's just an easy way for us to keep the presentation going, moving, and then we'll make sure that we hit every single question as long as you place it on that Jamboard. I want to make sure everybody got that link. I dropped it in the chat. I'm looking for heads of acknowledgement. A few folks turn off cameras. Okay. So we'll keep moving on. If you didn't get it, the link is in the chat. So here's a quick agenda for today. We're going to talk about workflow, particularly in the new guidelines that we've created for the use in Wildwood. That's the workflow I'm talking about. Next, we're going to be talking about file management, and it's one of the best benefits of Google Classroom, and talk about how that actually works and what that structure looks like. We're going to continue on with even more benefits of Google Classroom. If you can't tell, we're fans of the product. And then Mira's going to go in a really in-depth demo showing you how to get a classroom started, how to manage it, how to assign assignments, all the good stuff that you come here for. We're going to semi-end with the Q&A. The Q&A is when we'll look back at the Jamboard, see what questions may have popped up during the presentation, and make sure we answer all of them. And lastly, we're going to give you the opportunity to try it with us in a structured way.
I just want to make one note. You'll notice that we've actually turned on closed captions while we're giving our presentation. This is a sort of not as much used feature that's really great, especially with distance learning in terms of audio issues and connection. So we're just modeling what that would look like. Just know that if I had my headphones in, you actually wouldn't be getting the closed captioning from Nick talking.
So the closed captioning is within Google Slides. It's worth mentioning. It's a great tool, especially when we're considering all things accessibility. So let's start off with the workflow. This is a very intimidating looking flow chart, and it's something that we'll actually dig more into during the Intro Week session for Google Classroom. But we just wanted to show this. You may remember the email from Jamie that came out a few weeks ago, actually. And it talked about how the LMS and Google Classroom will be working together. Essentially, this is that email in a visual form, and just talking about what types of communications happen in the LMS, who has access to that. And you'll notice in this document, you've got the teacher, which is in the very center top. And then at the bottom, you have the little figure with the graduation cap, that's students. And then the household is for parents, guardians, etc. And so there's always been this discrepancy on what everybody can see in different platforms. And we think we've kind of figured it out with this graph. Like I said, I'm not going to go too deep into it, but I wanted to show us it here today, just to kind of get an early glimpse for those who are interested into what that structure would look like and what some of those expectations might be. file management. One of the strongest benefits of Google Classroom is its automatic uh, filing and structuring of the assignments that you create within Google Classroom. It's a powerful tool, and we just kind of wanted to talk about what that structure looks like because there has been confusion in the past. As soon as you create a Google Classroom, folders are created within your Google Drive, both on the teacher side, and actually we'll start with just the teacher side. So as a teacher, when you create a Google class, whatever you name that class will create a folder. Now, if you've never started a Google Classroom before, the first thing that will be created is a classroom folder. The folder will be called Classroom, and it will be placed at the top level of your Google Drive. Within that, every course that you create in Google Classroom will add a new folder with that specific name. And it's very important to remember that that first time you create a Google class, that's what that folder will be named. For instance, if you're creating Spanish 1, Section 1, Section A, Section whatever that might be, that's what it's going to be called in your Google Drive. So that's important to remember when you're creating your classes. Within that, you will have different folders that will be created automatically. Remember, you don't have to create any of these folders every time you create an assignment. Let's say you create a new writing assignment and students' documents are populated, they will all be housed in that folder for you. So we just wanted to mention this because this file management thing is great because you don't have to actually physically or intentionally put things into the right folders. It kind of does everything for you. And then on the student side, once they join your classroom, the same process happens for them. They get a classroom folder on the top level of the Google Drive. And within that, every class that they've joined or that they're a part of is now added as a folder. Now, the only difference in folder structure here is that for a teacher, when you have an assignment folder, you have one folder for the assignment with all of the assignments for every student in that class. Let's say it's the writing assignment, and you'll have 30 documents in there. For the student side, they'll have one class, but every assignment that they have in that class will be listed in that one folder, which is great. We just kind of wanted to talk about that structure. I think Mira will get into it a little bit deeper in the demo so you can actually see what it looks like, but we wanted to point that out. All right. Speaking of benefits, we talked about the folder structure. Additionally, the assignment management is probably one of the best features of Google Classroom. And if you're here today, you probably already know that. But it's a very easy way to distribute and collect student work. It's seamless. Google's design team has worked very well in both the language that they created, where they kind of know what most users want to click or where to look for what to click. But then it also integrates with their Google Suite. So if you've used Google Drive, Google Docs, Sheets, you probably will be very good with the user interface of Google Classroom because it's all the same design language. There's integration between the apps. So Drive, Sheets, Slides, they work very seamlessly with Google Classroom. Assessment, which is something we'll be touching on a little bit, a lot during intro week, is really powerful. The use of comment banks, which Mira will talk about a little bit later, and commenting directly on student work and with students in the back and forth is really above par from other ways of doing formative assessment. And then lastly, there's a growing number of third-party applications that have built-in integration with Google Classroom. And so you'll start noticing them as you start to collect your digital tools for remote learning, and you'll notice, oh, wow, this actually works directly with Google Classroom. And it's a growing list of companies that are joining it. So something to look out for, and also another benefit to pay attention to. So at this point, I'm actually going to turn it over to Mira, who's going to start us on the Google Classroom demo, and she has prepared some slides and some in-depth learning. And this is the part I know you all came for. So I'm going to turn it over to Mira.
Okay, so I'm going to do a pretty deep dive into like the nitty gritty of using Google Classroom. So as you know, Google Classroom is the free web-based platform that integrates with G Suite for Education. It's sort of like an LMS, but it's actually not an LMS, and we shouldn't be using it as an LMS. We need to be using Google Classroom as a way to distribute and collect work from students to create an easy, cohesive ecosystem for students' digital work. So right here, this is the main dashboard for Google Classroom. All your classes will show up here as tiles. The plus sign is where you either join a class, with a class code or create a class. And for each class, you can see that there's tiles, and you can actually click on the title to enter the class, or you can actually reorder your class tiles. And that's just like drag and drop. If you click on the 3-dot ellipse, which I have a little arrow that shows you, you get additional options to move, edit, copy, or archive. It's a really important feature, the archive, because the only classes that should be live on your dashboard are the classes that you're currently teaching. At the end of the school year, it's a good practice to archive your class. And just know, when you archive your class, you can always make a copy of that class the following year. And things copy like title, section, description, assignments, which is really great. They are copied as drafts with no schedule date, but some things that don't copy are like the students and the co-teachers and student posts and stuff like that. So the idea of using Google Classroom and setting up your class and the end of the year archiving it, and then reusing some of the work the next year is a really powerful feature. So now if you click on the 3 lines, this will open up the general menu. And this is where you have quick access to go to Google Calendar. There's actually integration with Google Calendar. A calendar is automatically created per Google Class. If you don't use this, you can actually go into Google Calendars and either hide or delete this calendar. It's up to you. You'll also have an area for to review, which is actually something I didn't know about until I was going into, do a deep dive of Google Classroom. And this is where you get a quick overview of the work you assigned across all your classes. You can see which work is turned in, graded, or not graded. You can also mark work for review. And you can filter this list by class. You can switch between your main classes without having to go back to the dashboard at any time. This 3 lines will show up while you're in a class. So you don't always have to be going back to the main dashboard to switch between your classes. You can get to your archive classes, and you can also get to your general classroom settings about email. When you actually click the plus sign, you'll be creating a class. And you're gonna, for consistency's sake, we're gonna ask that you're naming your class the same thing it's listed in the LMS. Now, don't worry about any of these specifics that I go over about settings. We're gonna be going over that more in detail in our required setting, and we'll also have a checklist that will go through all the specifics of anything that I mentioned today. So I know also people have been using this for advisory, which is not required, but if you do use it for advisory, our naming convention would just be your name - advisory. And remember that this initial naming of your class is also the name of the folder in your classroom folder. Although if you need to make a name change, you can change the name in Classroom. You just have to make sure you go back to that folder and you change the name manually. We're also going to ask that you add the section as the scholastic year, this would be 2020-21. And we recommend best practice that you create a class for each of your different sections. Again, we're going to have a checklist that has all those specifics, but in general, those are some of our recommendations. Once you create a class, you're going to be taken to the class landing page, which is on the screen right now. Here's where you see the stream, which is the activity of your class. Where it says share something with your class, this is a place for announcements. We're not going to be using this feature because all of our communication should be through the LMS. On the stream, the default setting is to have condensed notifications show up, which means any assignments will post and appear newest on top. Some of these things can be adjusted. You can change the header. You'll notice we have a custom header at the very top of our Google Classroom that you guys are going to be actually joining. You can upload your own like we have, or you can choose from a number of templates that are available to you. Just know the color scheme of the class is affected by the color scheme of the header, and you're going to want to set a different header for each of your different classes just for visibility for you. So when you're switching through your different classes, you're not getting confused. It's a good visual indicator. For the class code, you'll notice I have a little arrow that points to it right there. Students can join via the class code, or you can actually invite them to the class through the people section. they will still need to go in and accept the invitation in the main Google dashboard page. So under the class name, you'll see the class code, which is an assortment of numbers and letters. You just click on the display icon and you'll get a larger side display of the code. So say you're presenting this live or virtually, you can actually just click, present it, and have students join the classroom with you at that moment. The class code stays the same unless you go into the individual class settings and reset the class code. So this is something that stays static unless you go in and reset it. Once a student joins a class, it will always show up in Google Classroom unless you remove them from the class, or when you archive the class, it goes into archives and the student will not see that class anymore. In terms of individual class settings, this is different than the other settings. There's the general settings that I showed you that's in the 3 lines, right? But for each of the classes, they have their own individual class settings. You click on the gear icon, which you can see the arrow to, all right? And here, this is where you will see the class settings for each of the individual classes. A lot of the setup that you do is gonna be right here, and you're gonna have to do this for each of the classes, right? So in class settings, you can change things like the class details. Like I mentioned, you can reset the class code. You can change what and how things are showing up on the stream. There are certain recommendations we have about that. Really interesting and new is, and this is something we're going to more depth in our required session, is Guardians. Guardians is a way to connect your student's user account with their grown-ups. And here you'll notice there's a Guardian summary, and that by default is off, but we're going to be actually using Guardian feature, so you're going to want to turn that on. And so what is an email summary? Basically, the Guardian is going to get a prompt asking if they want to be receiving summaries. They have to opt into this. Email summary is like missing work, upcoming work, class activity. It is not the actual specific work. They're not going to be able to see the actual specific work, but they'll be able to see a summary of like what assignments are coming up, what assignments are missing, and stuff like that. One thing that's super important is we recommend that you change the class settings for the stream to only teacher can post or comment. And you can see that. That's one of our recommendations. Again, that's going to be on our checklist, but this is like we've mentioned previously, this isn't the space for students to be sort of interacting with each other on the stream or posting comments, and actual announcements and that kind of stuff should all be happening through the LMS. All right, so now we're in the People tab, and this is where you can manually add other teachers or students by clicking the People plus icon. You can add teachers, and this is something I really want to clarify. We're going to be having you add an admin user group. You might have remembered this from last year. Well, we're going to view this more in detail later, but always make sure when you're adding the admin user group or other teachers as co-teachers, add it to the teacher section, right, and not the student section. You might think this is like, you know, very obvious, but there are a number of people who actually added them to the wrong place. Here is also where you'll be able to invite guardians. You can see a little arrow about that. We'll be going over that more in detail in our required session. And if you click on the individual student name, you're going to be actually taken to that page summary of all the work. If you use the checkbox for the student, you'll notice you'll be able to do a couple of options here. We don't use email because we use Outlook, so you can't actually use that feature. You can remove a student. And you can also mute them, but that only is if you're using the commenting functionality, which again, we don't recommend. Here is the classwork tab. This is like the workhorse and the real reason why we want to actually be using Google Classroom. This is where you can be creating assignments for your students. You guys don't know, I'm into organization. This is where you can use topics to organize your assignments. This is something that's really useful for you and also for your students. You can drag and drop anything that's on the screen, both the topic order and the assignments within the topic orders and assignments to other topics. So it's all drag and droppable. And there are buttons at the top for quick access to Google Calendar and the Drive folder. Those are always accessible right here on the classwork tab. If you click the Create button, all right, here you can choose the type of assignment you want to create. And also you can create topics for organizing your work. You can also always create a topic while you're in an assignment. So you'll notice there's different types of assignments. You have a general assignment, which is what you're going to use for the most part, most of the time. Quiz assignment, which will create by default a blank quiz, aka a Google form, or you can obviously attach your own. A question, which is a single question, quick survey, short answer, multiple choice. Material, again, you shouldn't use this, as all materials should be housed in the LMS. And a very powerful feature is the reuse post, which allows you to reuse an assignment from any of your classes, whether live or archived. Again, think about how can you set yourself up for sustainability and not having to keep redoing things every year. You can be reusing work that you used last year. So when you're creating an assignment, for each assignment you have a title to put in for instructions. Again, title here should be listed as the same as the title that you put in for the assignment in the class LMS. And the real power of assignments is the add button. And this is where you can add multiple type of files and more than one file. So you're not limited to adding just one file to an assignment. You can actually add multiple ones. When you attach a file from Google Drive, this could be a doc, sheet, slide, drawing, etc. You'll notice you'll get these different options. Students can view, students can edit, and make a copy. One of the real powers of this is the make a copy for each student. And this is great because you make your template, whatever you want to be using, and then it will be making a copy for the student, and also it names it. So it names it with the student's name and whatever it is, the original file name. Really importantly, I if I was texting this, it would be in all caps. You're not able to go back and change the mega copy for students once you assign an assignment. So say you by accident forget this, you make your assignment and you've published it, you can't go back in and then change can view file to make a copy for each student. You're gonna have to actually create a new assignment. So it's worth taking a little time to just check to make sure you did this properly. Options on the right are, pretty basic. Choose which class and students. Google Classroom offers some great opportunities for differentiation. You can actually assign an assignment to only certain students. So say you want to differentiate some work to high flyers or some people who need a little bit more, review. You can assign them different assignments based on the person, right? You can also assign to multiple classes at the same time. Let's see, you can assign points or ungraded, add a due date, choose the topic that it will be in, or leave it not assigned to a topic, or create the topic at that moment. And then another powerful feature is to add a rubric for an assignment. You'll notice there's also check plagiarism. And this is the originality feature. Know that there are only 3 originality reports per class because we are using the free Google for Education account. Like I mentioned earlier, the power of the organization that Google Classroom does for you, when you hand out a copy to a student, it's gonna rename it, name of student, name of the original document that you handed out. So it does a lot of that work for you and for your students, and that's part of why we love Google Classroom. For an assignment, you can assign only to this class, pick which students will receive this assignment. Again, you can assign at that moment, you can schedule, you can save it as a draft to come back to it later. You can create this assignment for multiple classes at once. I wanna make a couple notes. If you're doing multiple classes at once, you're obviously not gonna be able to differentiate for individual students. And also, if you're doing multiple classes for once, you cannot use the scheduling feature. The scheduling feature only works if you're doing for that one specific class. So just to know. Here, I wanna go over a little bit the rubric. So if you add a rubric to your assignment, you can create it from scratch. Reuse a rubric that you already had been using previously in Google Classroom, or import from Sheets. You'll notice here's the create rubric sort of screen for you. You can just decide on if you want to use scoring or not. There's criterion title, example introduction, description, level title, etc., etc. You know, this is worth playing around with to see if you'd like to use it. And if you are using points, you can decide how much each of the level is worth, or you can notice on the right, you can just turn scoring off. Students are going to be able to see the rubric, and they're going to be able to see what you assigned them in the rubric. And you'll be able to grade with this rubric on the individual assignment submission within Google Classroom. For any assignment, students can also add additional files to their assignments. So there's no limit to the number of files or the size of files that students can turn in. They can upload any file directly to Google Classroom, or they can add a file that's already in Google Drive. I want to make a really important note that in terms of organization. So these additional files that are handed in via Drive or uploaded via Google Classroom, docs, slides, video, etc., they're going to be automatically put in the assignment folder for you as the teacher, right? But if a student is adding work that's already in Google Drive, it's not going to be moved into that folder for the student. And then also, if they are like uploading it, it's not going to be uploaded directly to the class for the student either. It goes into the root folder. So it's important to set up, first of all, if you're going to be having them hand in things, set up naming protocols, you know, and then also it's a good practice for them to actually upload their work to their classroom folder and then add it to Google Drive. Add it through the assignment. So just know that for you as a teacher, the organizational structure is really easy, but that's a little caveat if you're not doing a copy for student. So that's why one of our recommendations is, even if you're doing something like they're just doing a writing assignment and you don't even really need them to have a template, there's nothing, instructions or anything on it, it's worth having a blank doc that you hand out to them, just so that organizationally it's super easy for everybody. So when a student hands in a file, they lose their editing access at that point. You'll notice there's a turn in button. The turn in button on the actual work only shows up in Google Docs. So if they're turning in a spreadsheet or a slideshow or drawing, whatever, they have to do it through the classroom sort of section. But if they're doing a Google Doc, they can actually click the turn in button on the Google Doc. They can always unsubmit their work if they need to make an edit or add files to their submission, but this will change whether their assignment is late or not, if when they resubmit, if you had a due date. When you click on an individual assignments collection page, here's where you'll see all the students in your class and their work for this assignment. You can sort by who has turned in work, who has not turned in work. You can actually return work here. You can then click into the individual assignments or click on the individual student's name to see an overview of their work. A really important note is, especially for Google Docs, some files, a copy is only created for students when they actually have clicked into the assignment. So some things are handed out sort of automatically. I've done a little testing with this. So say you want the student to make a copy of a drawing, which is actually an assignment that you will be doing in your sample Google Classroom. It does that automatically, but for Google Docs specifically, if you hand out to your class and you notice that like there's no document created for the student, that means that they haven't actually gone in and clicked into that assignment. So when you're viewing an individual assignment submission in Google Classroom, it will show up in this fashion. You can cycle between submissions with the arrow, or you can use the upside down triangle to pick different students to view their different submissions here. You can add comments to an assignment, and you can actually add private comments. So there's a little difference between regular comments and private comments. Private comments, students see and can respond to when they open the assignment within Google Classroom. It doesn't exist anywhere besides Google Classroom. This is different than comments that are within a document, because those, as you know, can be resolved. Private comments cannot be resolved, and they also don't go away. There's no way to resolve them. They're kind of like stickies that stick with the assignment. And then there's comment bank, which is the little icon that's a speech bubble with bookmark. And that's where you can start putting in, so like a bank of comments, that things that you reuse. And you can click on there and then just like copy and paste those. So there, you're not always like typing everything out. So if you have some specific comments that you use often, you can think about sticking them in the comment bank to have reusable text while you're working on reviewing student work. You can always view these documents via Google Drive, but this is an easier access point and allows you, like I said, to add private comments, grade with a rubric, and return the work to students. The grade tab, which is the last tab all the way to the right, this is where you see an overarching view of all of your assignments. And you can see all of your assignments and also all your students and like, have they turned it in? Have you returned it, et cetera, et cetera. You can always click on an individual student to go in to see that student view, or you can click on a specific assignment and to see more details about that specific assignment. That's like the deep dive. I'm gonna do a couple tips and tricks and then we'll get to our question section. So some tips and tricks. Especially at the beginning of the year, you can think about creating a template of a digital graphic organizer and do the make a copy of students. You can think about the topics in terms of organizing your work. Do you want to organize by week, by unit, by topic? It is totally up to you. It's something to think about, especially if in the LMS we're organizing by week. You can think about also having topics that are organized by week. But again, whatever makes sense to you. We do recommend that you have some sort of organizational structure. Some other thing, like I mentioned previously, is really utilizing the make a copy for students. So you can make a copy of a blank document. You can make a copy of a blank slide template, or you can be handing out interactive HyperDoc. So there's lots of ways of, one, adding interactivity for your students, or two, just really helping maintain and streamline your workflow process for you and for them. Another important point is group projects. Since there's no like collaboration feature, you can either, make a copy for each student or have a whole entire class collection where everybody can edit the same document. But if you're having group projects, my recommendation is to pick a team leader, assign all the, files for that student, make a copy, and only for the team leaders, and then have the team leaders share their appropriate documents for collaboration, and they're the one that is responsible for sharing it out and then also handing it in. And that's a way to work around some of the limitations in terms of collaboration. And then also create your own header. Customize your Google Classroom, make it fun, also make it visually different from all your other classes so it's easier for you. And remember that the color scheme of your class is affected by the color scheme of the banner. One of the fun assignments that you can do if you wish when you join our Google Classroom is actually use a template that I've shared with you in terms of making a Google Classroom header. So those are our tips and tricks. Let's now go into our question phase.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Mira. Like you said, that was a deep dive into Google Classroom. A lot of information there. And like we said, we're recording this session, so there's the opportunity to go back and revisit some of the things she talked about if some of it was missed. And then also, we hadn't talked about it, but we'll make these slides available too, especially to this group. We'll just send out an email afterwards so that you can see these as well. I've been watching the Q&A board as things have been coming up, and I see a couple of folks are leaving some more things. So of course you can keep adding them, but I'm gonna start going through some of them. I read here somewhere, does Google Classroom, this one right here, I'm gonna make it a little bit bigger. Does Google Classroom connect with the LMS on campus topics? Can I drag LMS topics into Google Classroom? And Mira, I'll take this one, but the short answer is no. Our Google or our LMS does not integrate with Google Classroom in any way at all. And I think some of the confusion may have come with the idea of the word topics, right? There are topics or headers in Google Classroom, and then there are the topics that we know in our LMS within on campus. And those are totally different. Same language, same principle, but just totally different, and they do not talk to each other. Now, could you create topics that are similar in both places? Yes, in fact, we probably recommend it, and that's something we'll talk about in our next training session is for students, take your topics in on campus, and the topics or the headers in Google Classroom probably should match each other. And that makes it very easy for them to understand where to look for those things in both places. Let's take a look at another question. Um, Here we go. Does Google Classroom replace the need for student folders in Drive? And then under that, I think they were put together. I wonder if Google Classroom is necessary for clear file management system. If a clear file management system is set up with Google Drive, what is the difference slash benefits between the two? And Mira, do you want to touch on this? I kind of
Sure.
answered.
So, yeah, if you are using Google Classroom for your class, then your students don't need to create a specific class folder. It does remove some of that need for your students. And actually, in terms of file management, it would be confusing for you to ask them to create a folder if they also have a folder in the classroom folder. So that is a little point of difference. Our recommendation is if you're using Google Classroom, that folder is created automatically for a student. Encourage them to be putting everything else in that folder for your class. So utilize the inherent creation factor of Google Classroom to make those folders so that you don't have to have that setup part as a beginning part of the year. And so the difference between it is that a folder that a student creates for your class, this just is a folder that lives in Google Drive. The folder that Google Classroom creates, it talks to that folder. So it will like stick those copies in that folder for your student, right? So Google Drive is not gonna be talking to Google Classroom except for that actual classroom folder that is created by Google Classroom.
And I think there's a few folks in here who are in this session because they are trying to decide whether or not to use Google Classroom or just to create a file management system to talk to their students, or not talk to, but for that distribution of documents. And so that's what we're hoping to give you clarity on. And hopefully you're starting to see that now. And what Mira basically said is that there's a way for both to exist as well. If you wanted to have a file management system and use Google Classroom, but her practices that she just outlined are really the best ways to go about it.
I do notice there's a couple things about rubrics, and so we will make sure we talk more about rubrics in our next session and maybe even do a very specific session all about Google rubrics. So we're going to actually be answering the Google rubrics more in the next session or in one specifically devoted to rubrics. And then Kami. So actually Kami integrates with Google Drive, and you can actually have it integrate with like your documents. So they're, like we said, like third-party integrations. There's a lot of them. And you can actually say you assign work and the student hands in a PDF or an image. You can like open it up within the sort of classroom and then edit it in Kami. And that's something that we can go over in more detail later. And if you specifically want like more instruction on that, send us an email and we can make sure that we actually meet with you individually. So things like,
Also,
yes.
real quick, Mira, too, we just got an email, I think either this morning, last night, from new associate head Christina about what you would like to see in intro week. And I think there's a Google form that she embedded in her email. So definitely, I think there is specifically a question about ed tech tools or tech tools that you would like to learn about in intro week. So that would be the best place to send any recommendations of things you're thinking about that you would like to learn more about, because we'll be working with directors and associate head of school on intro week planning as well. And
So
Kami, sorry, one more thing,
yes.
Mira. Kami is one of those third-party apps I was talking about that integrates really well with Google Classroom. And
Yeah.
so if that is something you're thinking about, wow, it's a powerful tool. With, I think, the pro level. I don't know if the free one does it well, but with the paid version, it seamlessly integrates with Google Classroom and in a way that's really, really awesome.
I would say I think the free version is sort of sufficient, but we can definitely we'll definitely bring that up later. Here, is there a file? No, there's not a file size limit in Google Classroom because we don't have a file size limit in Google because we're education. So we do not have a file size limit. Although if someone's handing something in really big, it's just gonna maybe take a little longer because they have to upload it. In terms of what would be the best way to collect images files through Google Classroom versus individual student folders in Drive. That's kind of a decision up to you as a user. So if you as a user want to be looking at each assignment individually, you like to go in and have a dashboard where you can, you know, click in an individual assignment. So here, say Google Classroom, the Wildwood Way. If you like to be able to go in here and actually like click on a specific assignment and view all the student work, like who's turned it in, have a record of who's turned work in and who hasn't turned work in. That's sort of why I might use Google Classroom for the management feature, right? If you don't really care about that and you just have the students create a folder and they're dumping all their work in there, that's fine. Again, it's partially up to you. I love the management of being able to go into a specific assignment and see who's turned in a work and who has not turned in work. And I can add comments here as well. So that's part of the reason why you might want to use Google Classroom in terms of the management piece. In terms of, yes.
Sorry, Mira. There are a lot of questions coming in right now, but we have about 15 minutes, and I do think we want to get into the last part of our session together, considering we want to keep time of the essence, right?
Yes.
Our last part is kind of an opportunity for you to try out a Google Classroom as a student. Is that correct, Mira?
Yes.
Like the best way to put it? So look at that. My Google's talking to me. So what we want to do is, I'm going to keep looking at these questions. Mira, do you want to get us started on the next part of this session where we allow people to join the classroom?
Yeah.
And I hope that some of these questions will be answered. If not, we'll stick around after and we'll answer a few more questions off recording if that works for you.
So you'll notice on the screen, we have the join code. So all you need to do is go to classroom.google.com, go to your main dashboard, and then click the plus sign and click join a class. And you'll join the class with this code right here. And remember, like lowercase is an uppercase is important. So it's lowercase NY55YMN. And you'll get the chance to see some sample assignments. One is a Google document, just so you can see what it looks like to receive a Google document, what it looks like to have a little bit of a rubric, how would you turn it in, and then you have a couple of sort of exciting assignments in terms of like I've made a template for a Google Classroom header and also a template for a Bitmoji class. One's a drawing, one's a slide. So I also want to encourage you to think about how can you creatively use Google to also do interactivity. I saw there was a question about HyperDocs. HyperDocs are pretty awesome. They're a way of making a Google Doc more interactive. I would say that's something we might actually go over in more detail in another session, but there's actually, isn't it called like hyperdocs.com or something?
Yeah, I can pull up that link and I'll drop it in the chat.
Yeah, so there's an actual link to a site that's all about HyperDocs and has training and stuff like that. The real great part about HyperDocs is it's providing some of the instruction and interactivity via the document. We've used it, for example, in our Merge Quest, and I'll actually just show you an example of what that looks like. So like in this assignment, this is a HyperDoc. So what we're using is links and instruction and points of interaction so that the student is running through all, and again, you can be really creative with this, but they're running through things we want them to do, like responses, actions that they have to take, learning that they're doing, feedback, all sorts of things within this Google document. And then we're able to go in and sort of facilitate any issues that they're having. So it's a way of making interactivity within Google Docs. It's pretty awesome. It's a great way of helping facilitate learning with your students instead of you having to do like direct instruction. The students sort of going through and doing the work at their own place. It's a way of sort of blended learning. And here you can just see the example that we did with the students, and there's points where they actually have to do work. That wasn't a very articulate explanation, but that's kind of the gist.
I dropped a link for hyperdocs.co, which is a great website for referencing on how to create that hyperdocs and what that's all about.
Okay, does anyone still need the code on the screen?
And I also put the link, where you're going to go first is classroom.google.com.
Yeah.
I'll put that again in the chat. And then you're going to click join class and use the code.
And it's worth bookmarking classroom.google.com. It just makes life easier. And our classroom, Google Classroom, the Wildwood Way. Again, here you will have assignments that you can take a look at. And here, if you're looking at the screen, you can see the really awesome thing is like drafts. You can be making stuff and not having to publish it right away. So the draft feature and the scheduling feature are great ways to kind of automate and make your work sort of a little bit easier. Nick, is there any other questions you want to like hit out right now?
Yeah, looking at the chat, there seems to be discussion around file types that are acceptable within Google Classroom. And where I think I want to clean it up, Mira, maybe you can help me answer this,
sure.
Is I think there's confusion around the idea you brought up when not assigning a Google document within Google Classroom and the student is submitting files outside of the system, whether it's like a JPEG, a PNG, a movie file, what happens in that file management, that system. I think that's what I'm seeing in the.
Okay, to clarify that, when a student goes in and they're, I'm going to go back here and I'll go to that actual slide. So the difference between when you are handing out work to a student versus your student is handing in other files. So, oh, I think I went too far. When you're handing out work to a student, like you've made a copy for a student, it automatically gets organized for you and it automatically gets organized for your student. But your student at any point can be handing in work that they've done at another time or another place that you didn't hand out, right? The difference there is for you as a teacher, it automatically gets organized in your drive in that assignment. So for you as a teacher, the organization process is pretty easy. So if I'm the student and I am attaching files, I'm adding or I'm creating stuff, I'm adding a movie. For me as a teacher, it makes life really easy because it gets organized automatically for me. For the student, if you add a file that lives in your Google Drive, it's not moving that file for the student. For the student, it's just sort of appending it to the classroom for them. So they've handed in that work. But if I'm a student and I just have a slide presentation, it's living in a folder named presentations, it's gonna stay living in that presentation folder. It doesn't get moved for that student. If a student is uploading work directly through Classroom, what happens is it ends up living in the root folder for Google Drive, and the student would have to just organize it. That's why I said making the recommendation that if you know the student's going to be sort of creating files or uploading things, just have them put it by default in that Classroom folder that gets created by Google. That's my recommendation. For you as a teacher, the organizational structure is always much easier, but this whole entire like attaching something that they've already done in Google Drive, it doesn't move it for the student. Hopefully that helps sort of clarify that.
Mira, if you could show slide 5 with the file management structure.
Sure. Show it.
And essentially this is what Mira was pointing out. This file structure works all the time for teachers, no matter how you assign an assignment. What Mira was pointing out is that if you don't assign an actual document, like a doc, slides, or sheets, and you ask the student to submit their movie file or submit their image, their classroom structure, the folders will look the same, but the file won't be in that classes folder. Is that an easy way of putting it,
Yeah,
Mira?
that's easy. So this whole entire right here where it says student assignment, that only happens when you've made a copy for the student.
Mhm.
And that's part of like if you're using Google Classroom, the class folder, encourage the students, like if they're making an extra document or uploading other things, use that class folder because then they don't have to worry about reorganizing it later. And there are certain reasons why Google does this for students. So say that they have a file somewhere else, like I have a file on my root drive and I'm handing it in. Again, it doesn't get moved into that folder as a student because it already lives on their drive. And I think Google just does that so like people aren't like, where did my file go? Why did it get moved? Um, so that's part of like coming up with best practices for your students. Encourage them to always be putting everything they're doing in a class folder. So say for example, I giving my students the option to create a presentation however they want. Could be a slide, could be a movie, whatever it is, and they're actually adding it to the class assignment. If I have them originally create that work in the class folder or like upload it to the class folder, then I don't really need to be worrying about the organizational structure for students. And actually, truthfully, students don't really care about this at all. It's like us that care about making sure that they're organized. But you're really coming up with structure and procedures. So say you want your students to be handing in like a movie or like an image, like tell them first step, just drag it to your class folder and then hand it in through class assignment. Or they can do the opposite way where they hand it in and then later they take that work and they drag it to their class folder. It can go either way. I think it's easier to come up with the convention of having them automatically always put everything in their class folder in the first state. And again, if they are handing in work that exists outside of the make a copy for the student, it's also important to have a convention of what they're going to be naming their files, just to make everybody else like life easier.
Awesome. Um, it seems like there's almost a PD in store for the way that Google Drive works as well, and the ways that files and folders and how that sharing actually looks and how things can exist in two places at once and still be the same file. But because of the sake of time, here's what we're going to do. Hopefully everybody was able to join the class and start working on that experience of the student view and being in Google Classroom. Go ahead and try to work on some of those assignments and send them back, see what that process looks like. Um, and then what we're going to do today is close the session formally. We're going to stop the recording. Me and Mira will definitely stay back for questions if folks want to jump on the microphone and ask those questions. But as far as the formal presentation of Google Classroom, I think this will be the closing here.